It's a pretty well kept secret that in Guild Ball, when they design the game, they have a kind of talking stick that they use that lets you know who's really in charge of Guild Ball and who's allowed to design things at the moment. And it takes the form of a crown. And this person is referred to as the king of Guild Ball while they're speaking in the design circles. Right? And fresh back from WTC, Alex Botts and Pat Van Bailey managed to steal this crown and gave it to me because they knew that my hands were the best hands to use it. Right? So without further ado, I present to you Vincent Curkov, the newest king of Guild Ball. Right. In light of WTC, I want to talk about essentially the competitive play system, and I want to kind of rework that. We're about to hit a new year, just a couple months out, so I want my decisions made here to have time to be play tested because I don't always make perfect decisions the first time, just most of the time. So first of all, let's overhaul the OPD. I want to get rid of this minor guild nonsense. Minor guilds have had it too good for too long, and now that we've clearly seen that the minor guilds are being buffed to a point where they can compete with the major guilds, they no longer need their +1 initiative roll and their extra plot card. This has always struck me as kind of a band-aid. Either all the guilds in Guild Ball are competitive or they're not. I think the OPD should treat everybody the same. The fact that they only have 8 players either needs to be rectified or admit that it's not actually a problem and that minors are just fine. So I think we're just going to do away with that, and I think it solves a lot of problems and especially makes it gives you some freedom to kind of mess around with some of the organized play stuff in other ways and complicated in other ways. So it's kind of like in game design, there's this idea of like you have a complexity budget and you can only spend so much complexity before you start to lose fun. So let's use this little footnote to add a little bit more complexity somewhere else. And where I'm going to use that is I'm going to use that by reworking the drafting order. When Season 3 first came out, you drafted everything. You drafted your entire 6-model roster going back and forth, and I really liked it. It unfortunately gave huge advantages to teams that were good at hiding their captain, that had kind of ubiquitous squaddies. If that was the case right now, I think Brewers would come as an obvious choice of like people would have an advantage in it. Because if I draft Hooper, Spigot 1, Decimate 2, I can play, and then Quaff, I can play any captain from here. Every single Brewers lineup has those 4 players in it. And the only 2 choices are the captain and your final squaddie. To rectify this, they decided to make Captain Mascot a blind reveal at the same time. I think this takes some of the strategy out of the game. I think some of the argument is that it gives newer players a more fighting chance where they might just drop the one captain they know how to play. And even though I have one of the captains that would hard counterpick theirs, we can't do that. So I think we should do away with blind pick. I liked the drafting. I think drafting is fun and interesting to talk about. And I think drafting is fun and interesting to talk about. But so drafting is fun and interesting to talk about, but the main problem still remains of drafting your captain last is way too strong for particular guilds. And this is especially bad in the minor guilds, who essentially, like, they're locked into their captain and mascot choice. So that would put them at a further disadvantage on top of the fact that I just took their main advantage in the pregame structure away. So what we're going to do is we're going to draft every model Receiving player picks first, right? And it's going to go, you draft your captain, the other player drafts their captain. You draft your mascot, the other player drafts your mascot, and then you draft your squaddies back and forth. I think this really can add a lot of complexity and a lot of interest into the game. I think there are certain teams that have major disadvantages when they kick, but being able to see which captain the opponent's going to play first can give them some advantage. For minor guilds, they essentially get to skip the first round. They get to know what captain you're playing the same way they currently do, where they're locked into their captain mascot, right? And they get to essentially know what you're doing at the same time you do. From there, I would like to change how the roll-off works slightly. Right now, you win the roll. You can choose to kick or receive, right? Or you can pick. So you choose to kick or receive. Kicking player picks side. I think this should be worked slightly differently. I think if you win the die roll, you can choose who kicks or receives, or you can choose side. If you're a team that is so like this seems like the same at first, but there's a slight nuance here. The main thing it does is like let's say let's say I'm playing like Thresher, and Thresher's, while I'm not certain he's stronger kicking, he has a very consistent kickoff, and especially if you're playing at like mid-level tables where you understand the mechanics of your guild very well, but you're maybe not as adaptable as a high-level player would be, having a really solid turn one just sets you up for success in Guild Ball. And that player would likely choose to kick, and they'd get to both kick and get the side they wanted. And then at the higher level play, if, say, for example, a specific guild always wants to kick no matter what, I think removing the advantage of picking side would do an interesting amount to mix up the game. It's mainly that I want each player to get a choice. So if I get to pick, kick, receive, and I choose to kick, the other player still gets to pick which side. And I think this will help balance out the kick receive win rate, which right now is still way in kick's favor. And I think a lot of that has to do with from choosing side, and the people that choose to kick are playing a guild that kicks very, very well. And so when they win the roll, they get everything, and when they lose the roll, they only get to pick side, which is 50% of the pie, whereas most guilds want to receive and choose side and never get to do that. So I think that'd be those would be like the three main changes I would make to the OPD. Oh, important update. I forgot to mention that Second Wind's coming out. So come to Second Wind, guys. October 19th, 20th. I've got tons of amazing prizes and sponsors lined up. Right, I have 3 slots open on the not on the wait list, on the actual thing. You pay, you get in. There's no long wait list. It's going to be the second largest event ever in America. It's going to be the largest event this year, largest season 4 event in the States. It's at Alarmist Brewery, an award-winning brewery, won North American Beer Awards for Best Hazy IPA. Truly fantastic place, fantastic guys running that spot. The event's going to be 2 days long, free lunch on day 1. We got an excellent food truck lined up for day 2. It should be an absolutely amazing time. If you're interested in the WTC and want to know what it was like, come to Second Wind and ask. All 9 American WTC players will be in attendance. Right? And if you're worried about the level of competition, because this is also U.S. Nationals, right? I throw a great event for casual players too. A fantastic wooden spoon prize for last place, as well as some fantastic prizes you can win in tons of other ways. Best faction, uh, best painted, best goal. However you want to compete, come out and compete. And there's just some absolutely fantastic people coming that aren't the best in the world, and they're absolutely worth meeting. It's really going to be a showcase of what makes the community of our game so special. Come out if you can. Thanks. We're going to move on, and I'm going to attempt a Reach of Power as my second act as King of Guild Ball. Right? Because all good kings try to increase their reach and increase their kingdom. So let's reach into WTC, which, to be clear, the King of Guild Ball has little to no say in, other than the OPD. WTC just happened, and if you don't know what WTC is, because I'm using an acronym, it's the World Team Championships. Countries from mostly Europe and a couple other places in the world descend somewhere in Europe to compete in a 3-on-3 team matchup where you're essentially playing a best of 3 all at once to try to determine the country that's best at Guild Ball. The third annual World Team Championships just concluded. Germany won again. Their dynasty is pretty undeniable. 2 members of that team have never changed. I think Timmy and Metz have proved that they're top tier competitors the world over and aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And congratulations to them. What's different about this WTC is that it's the last World Team Championship where War Machine and Hordes and Guild Ball will be sharing a venue. Guild Ball striking out on its own this coming year. And I think it's a great opportunity to really mix up the format and really make it our own, because there's a lot of ghosts of the format left over from War Machine and Hordes. So if you don't know, this was a War Machine and Hordes event originally that was dreamed up by, I'm not even sure I ever knew, but it was originally a 5v5 format. You couldn't duplicate warcasters, which are like their captains. And you like draft back and forth to determine table locations, and then you're essentially playing a best of 5 all at once. Guild Ball being a smaller game, it's harder to put 5 people together, and there's probably a couple countries that wouldn't be able to put 5 people together. And so we went to 3 people, and we mirrored a lot of their rules, including the no duplicate captains rule. I would like to see a handful of these rules change. Let's really take an opportunity to customize this team-style format for our game. Right? We're no longer living in their shadow. We're our own event. Let's put our own spin on World Team Championships. So I'm going to essentially suggest 3 or 4 main changes, and I hope the WTC community sees this and kind of takes the best of my ideas, or what they think the best of my ideas, and really run with them. Right? I mean, as your king, I demand that you do so. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this duplicate captains rule. It's archaic, and it's a cookie cutter shape not designed for our game. So if you don't know, War Machine and Hordes, each faction has like 50 captains. Right? There are so many. So being like no duplicate captains, there are teams that can take 5 Crix 5 Crix players, and all play different captains, and all have really, really viable, strong lists. In fact, I think America won it one year playing that skew where it was just like, yeah, they had like 2 teams meant to sweep infantry off the table, or 2 players that were good at sweeping infantry off the table, but there were 5 teams of mass infantry, or there were 5 players of mass infantry on that team, and they just like rolled over people. And I think that's interesting. I would either remove the no captains rule completely and let people play just like kind of whatever they want. I think you'll still have diversity, since The 3 years of WTC have kind of proven that most people don't wildly jump faction. And I think you will still have a great amount of diversity. And of course, there is some risk that we're going to end up with just a bunch of teams playing triple fish. Europe loves to play fishermen. Every WTC has been full of fishermen. I think this year had like 20 teams with a fisherman player on them. So there's some risk that we might run into skews that are like, we're all fishermen. Like, what do you want? But if we're really worried about that as a problem, like, let's just make it all single faction. I would heavily prefer that to this, like, no duplicate captains thing. And the blacksmiths problem has always really bothered me. The fact that the blacksmiths have a loophole to this rule where they essentially all masters can also be captains, but now you designate captains to or you designate masters that can play as captains within it, which is not how blacksmiths work in one-on-one. All masters can possibly be captains. And it's this cookie cutter rule that they made this exception that you can play in order to allow you to play triple blacksmiths. And I really think that all masters should have just been declared captains, that if you wanted to play blacksmiths in multiples, you should have been forced not to be able to share masters amongst lists. I realize that essentially makes that team probably unplayable, right? But it kind of does that from a competitive sense to all the other teams. And surprise, surprise, the only team to ever be played in triplicate or even doubled up on the same team is blacksmiths, who have an exception to the rule. So I think they should just iron that out. It's an archaic leftover from War Machine and Hordes that doesn't really apply to us. I mean, I was really excited when Union was the first to have 3 captains to play Triple Union, but that's not even real anymore now. Maybe there's an argument to keeping the rule in case people want to play stuff with, because now most guilds are going to have 3 captains by the end of the year. Fingers crossed. So maybe that can be an argument to keep it, but I think really until every single team has 4 captains, that this won't be a like widespread or even legitimate thing where people double up on the same team. I really think you need the double captain pairing. So I say either deal with the rule or extend it to be duplicate factions, because that's what you actually want. All right. Move on. I want to change the pre-game sequence of World Team Champs to be more interesting. There's kind of 3 sections to this. Again, earlier I talked about like the complexity budget that you have, and I might be overspending here, but all 3 of these ideas are good on their own, in my opinion. So I'd like to see at least one of them implemented. So even though if we went with all of them, I think it would be probably too much. I'm going to still lay them all out. So first of all, I want kick receive to be a 2-to-1 ratio across the 3 teams. So essentially, when you roll for kick receive, instead of doing it at each table after you've finished the draft process, you'll roll and each team will roll, and the team that wins can choose to either have one player on their side go first or receive, or 2. I think it gets closer to the issue of like kick receive, and we all agree that the coin flip is very important. And I want to minimize those times when one team just wins all the coin flips and as a result has massive advantage going into their set. But maybe I'm skipping ahead too far. Let's back up a little bit. Because before you roll off, you have to do plots. I think the teams should do plots together. I think emphasizing how much teamwork is done, because right now it's just it's essentially you're playing 3 separate games of Guild Ball. The only team interaction is trying to maneuver your matchups. Let's have more teamwork happen, right? So let's start off by having each table will be dealt plot cards. So this is before we draft, before we know who's kicking and receiving, all that stuff. 7 cards to each side of each table. Draft plots for each table as a team, and then you can you have this really interesting extra dynamic of creating like a do you have a team that do you have a table that has terrible plots? Which player is most capable of playing with those terrible plots? Or can you dump your bad matchup there? Can you bait them into taking their automatic win matchup on the table that already has plots that make whatever you put there pretty unwinnable? Right? I think that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think just the idea of like the 3 of you talking and drafting your plots together and really working through what you think's good, and then also trying to maximize it across what your guilds can use, because maybe shove the boot in is really good for your Grange team, but really, really terrible for the fish order that are alongside you. Right? So I think those are really, really interesting. So after you do that, the teams roll off. One team gets to pick that they get 2 receives and the other team gets 1 kick. Or they can choose to go second in the drafting order. Or they can choose first, second in the drafting order. I say this because I haven't thought about first, second in the drafting order enough with my changes to the drafting order, which we're going to get into in a sec. But I'm very worried that going second is a huge disadvantage in the drafting order. But just because I feel that doesn't mean that everyone will feel that way, and I think we need to put it to a test before we actually go through with this. But essentially, so you get the 2-to-1 kick ratio, and then the drafting order changes. Currently, how WTC drafting works is you each get a side table or one table to put a player on, and you guys each blindly put a player on it, and you reveal those players. Then you blindly put your players on the 2 remaining tables. So you'll know one of the matchups you have, they'll know one of the matchups you have, and then there'll be like one pseudo-random matchup, but usually you can kind of puzzle out where it's going to be. I think, again, this makes the draft less interactive. I believe War Machine uses an alternating no simultaneous reveal, and this is because they have 5 players. And having 5 players makes the first, second decision less important, or less like kind of backbreaking, where like in our example, so I believe this is a little bit hard to get into because it's a little bit game theory-ish. But essentially, I get to pick, let's say I'm going first. We essentially offer up a sacrificial lamb that you can put any of your players into. Right? And so you guys are going to get that matchup you want. And then you guys are going to offer somebody up. Now we get 2 matchups we want because we know the player you have left you're holding. Right? And we know the player you put down. So we should be able to get 2 matchups we want. Now, it's not as cut and dry as you get 1 matchup you want, we get 2 matchups you want, because maybe that player we offered up first is the perfect foil to one of those other 2 matchups. So there's some opportunity cost there. But I highly suspect that going second in the draft is a huge disadvantage. So I imagine we'll do the 2 receives going first, or going second in the draft. But you can also just make it choose. Like maybe it can be an execution tester. Like, do they understand what's going on with the drafting system? But I think making that drafting system more interactive, having more conversations with your team about the main team aspect, which is really only in the pregame. Once the pregame is done, you're solo trying to rock out a win for your team, and that's all there is to it. You can root for your buddies, but you can't interfere in their games. You can't do anything. Um, and essentially, those are my three changes for WTC. I want to draft plots to the table and draft them as a team so that there's more interaction working there. I want to set up a system that involves a 2-1 kickoff receive ratio. And then finally, I want to make the draft more back and forth. As far as number of players, I think it'd be interesting to go up to 5 players, but I think that makes it a lot harder for some teams. America could probably put out 2 teams then. Right now, America is easily able to field 3 teams with 9 players going. Probably wouldn't be a huge stretch to find one more player, especially because they found 9 players, and I couldn't go this year, and I've gone every year before, and really wanted to go this year, but I just couldn't make it work. So I think America would be fine. I'm more worried about the teams that will have to cut a player. They can really only field 2 teams, meaning that somebody that's gone to WTC like every year, just like that slides into that last spot, but is that last spot by a good margin, won't be able to find himself 4 more players to play with. So that's a good change for the people that have 3 teams, and probably fine for the people that have 1 team. But for the people that have 2 teams, it's really mean. So I don't really want to change that aspect. And if that means we can't do the draft the way I proposed we change it to, I think that's fine. I still think that on the kick receive roll off, we should find some way to give advantage to the other team that lost the kick receive roll off because they are playing at a disadvantage. But let me know what you guys think. Am I being a good king? Do you think that these changes are things you'd like to see? Let me know in the comments down below. Like this video. It helps other good Guild Ball players find this video. And share it with your friends. Till then, I'm Vincent Curkov, and I'm the King of Guild Ball.